In this video, we'll take a closer look at epic dramas and their origin. And in order to really understand this, you have to have watched my video about how the world was created. Because I explained in there that there is a succession of spheres. Our world that we are in is the latest in a series of spheres. And there are actually 6 previous to ours. We are in the 7th. And the first 3 spheres ascended without any beings being left behind. Starting with the 4th sphere, there were some beings that would not ascend when the rest of the spheres ascended, so they fell into the 5th sphere and therefore became what I call fallen beings. And again, in the 5th sphere, some fell, in the 6th sphere, some fell, and they ended up in our sphere. So, in order to understand epic dramas, we have to realize that a new life stream is created in a specific sphere. And as I explained in the previous discourse about personal dramas, some life streams can develop these personal dramas that makes them deny their connection to the one mind and their ability to grow in self-awareness through the one mind, by using the one mind. So they go into this personal drama. And these beings that I call fallen beings, they were also created as new life streams in their sphere, whether it was the 4th or the 5th or the 6th, and they started growing like other co-creators. And they went into this state of that I call the consciousness of separation, the illusion that you are a separate being. And they started using the duality consciousness, which is what you use in order to justify and explain this state of separation and why you are not growing with the rest of the sphere. And so what happened in these previous spheres was that the vast majority of the new co-creators that were created in a sphere, they, after a relatively short period of time, they all went on what we can call the upward path or the path to Christhood, where they were seeking to expand their connection to the one mind and transcend their sense of self based on, as I said, connecting to the one mind, realizing you are more than any role you have created. But there was a small number of life streams that refused to do this. So they created their own roles. And as I explained in the previous one, even on a natural planet, there could be a certain division where some life streams are growing and others are not. And so what this can lead to is that a planet can actually come to a point where the vast majority of the life streams on the planet are ready to ascend to the spiritual realm and become ascended masters. But there is a group of beings that are not. And so what then happens? Well, it varies a little bit. There are different scenarios that can play out, but let's just look at one scenario. And that is that those life streams who are ready to ascend, they do so. They ascend. So they are now ascended masters. They are no longer in embodiment on that particular planet. So who is left on the planet? Well, only, or at least the vast majority of them, beings who have gone into separation. Now, as I said, these beings have gone into separation by creating a personal drama. And according to the law of free will, they have a right to do this. I mean, you can, as I said, there comes a point where you have to start defining your own roles that you are playing. And you can define that based on your awareness of the one mind, so you see yourself as connected being, or you can define it based on denying the one mind, therefore going into separation. And as I said, it's essentially 2 ways to grow, you could say. One is faster, one is less painful, but it's just 2 ways to grow. So, as I also said, or at least, no, I didn't say that in the last video, but in a video about how the world is created, I'm talking about how the purpose of the entire world of form is that we start out with a a point-like sense of self, and we gradually expand our sense of self. And we start in an unascended sphere, this process of growing. We start in an unascended sphere, and then our highest potential is that we can ascend from that sphere, become an ascended master. But there are levels of ascended masters. There are levels of the spiritual realm. So even after we've ascended, we can continue to expand our sense of self upwards until we reach the greater consciousness. So essentially, the purpose of creation is to educate more creators. So how do you become a creator? Well, you become a creator by starting as a point-like sense of self in a particular world of form created by another creator. And there, by working your way up, you are learning what works, what doesn't work. Because the question for any world of form really is it sustainable or will it self-destruct? So by experiencing our world of form at all the different levels, you can expand your sense of self until you reach the greater consciousness, and now you have the experience necessary to create your own world of form. And this is just how the entire process is being going on, basically beyond time. It's meaningless to even say forever. There was nothing that started this process, but this is a whole other discussion I won't go into here. So that's why you can say, okay, but live streams in this unascended sphere, what's the purpose? Why is a sphere unascended? Why is a sphere first created as an undescended sphere? Well, that's because this allows free will to be exercised fully. Because in an ascended sphere, there are only ascended masters. And you become an ascended master how? You become an ascended master when you have experimented with free will. And as I've said many times, there are two ways to exercise free will: as a connected being, as a separate being. So you experiment with your free will both as a connected being and as a separate being until you have had enough experiences of exercising your free will as a separate being, and therefore you consciously, voluntarily, based on your experiences, you decide, I'm ready to give up exercising my free will as a separate being and only exercise it as a connected being who sees itself as part of the one mind, sees all other beings as part of the one mind. Therefore, I have no need to force others. I'm not in competition with others. This is how you ascend. You attain what we can call the Christ consciousness or the Buddhic consciousness, where you are aware of your experience. It's not theoretical. You experience the oneness of all life. That's how you become an ascended master. So in other words, in the ascended realm, there are no beings who want to experiment with separation, because they have consciously given it up, knowing what they gave up. So you could say that the purpose of an unascended sphere is to give live streams the opportunity to experiment with separation and duality until they've had enough of it and consciously and voluntarily give it up. So now the only question really is, when has a particular live stream had enough of experimenting with separation and duality? And so, as I said, there were some natural planets where a number of live streams decided we've had enough of experimenting with separation and duality, and they ascended. So who was left on the natural planet? Only those who hadn't made that decision yet. They were still experimenting with duality and separation. Now, when you go into separation, as I've explained many times in my videos about non-duality, you are in an inherent conflict with other people. You are in an inherent conflict with your environment. And so this means that when you have a natural planet and most of the beings ascend, then those who are left, who are in separation, there will be conflict between them. Groupings will form. And this means that within a very short time, this is no longer a natural planet. It becomes an unnatural planet like Earth, because now you have conflict, it leads to suffering, and there's fighting between different groups. So again, you could say, is this allowed? Yeah, it's allowed. It's part of what an unascended sphere is for. So over a very long period of time, what happened in, let's say, the fourth sphere, which was the first sphere where this happened, there were certain planets where there was one or a small group of beings who set themselves up as leaders. In many cases, there was a struggle between two groups, for example, but eventually one of them prevailed, eradicated the other group. What also happens is, there can be life streams from other unnatural planets that come and embody on a planet, and eventually what happened was that there was a smaller and smaller number of unnatural planets, so those who had gone into duality, they were concentrated there. But what happened on some of these planets was there was these few beings who had set themselves up as the undisputed leaders, what you would call a dictator on Earth, who had absolute power over society. And this ties in with what I described in the personal dramas talk, where I said that some beings don't want to take responsibility for defining their own roles, so they just want to have roles defined for them. So this means that you now have those who are leaders and those who are followers. And the followers just pretty much, they're the blind following the blind, as Jesus talked about. They just want to be told what role to play in society. And so you had these few beings who had become very powerful on their planet. And how had they become powerful, mind you? Because what happens on these unnatural planets is that basically all of the beings there have defined a certain personal drama. But as you can see, there are some dramas that are passive. We just want to have our roles predefined. And then there are some dramas that are aggressive because they are based on trying to take the duality consciousness to its ultimate extreme. And so at a sort of beginning level, you can say that those who become the active users of the duality consciousness, they are trying to set themselves up as having power and privilege on their planet. Right? They just simply want to be the most powerful being on that planet. And they do this by creating some kind of personal drama that's beyond what the passive people have created, where they come up with some explanation why it's so important that they have power. And it can be that they are the smartest being on the planet, they have the best vision of how things should be done, they are better at making a society function. But it can also be that they are the saviors or the caretakers of the passive people, and they're the only ones who can really tell them how they should live their lives so that the planet doesn't self-destruct. And so, for a time, such a being can actually think that it has the power to run a planet based on the consciousness of separation, but only for a time, because, as I've explained in many of my videos about non-duality, there's an inherent contradiction, a built-in contradiction in duality. There's always the two opposite polarities, they're always in a struggle against each other, so there's always a struggle. And the struggle leads to suffering, and the struggle means that how do you attain absolute power on a planet? By using the duality consciousness to define one ultimate ideology, religion, political belief system, worldview. You're defining a worldview, say this is the ultimate truth. In comparison to that opposite polarity that's wrong. So this is the only way it can work in duality. There's always going to be an opposite. So that means that for a time, you can use the one dualistic polarity to suppress the other and to make sure that no people believe in that. But remember what I said in my previous discourse where I said we are co-creators. So we are constantly projecting. We are creating a worldview in our identity bodies, based on, for example, this being who thinks has the ultimate truth and it's the smartest person on the planet, and a more detailed worldview in a mental body, and then we project it through the emotional and physical. And when you are projecting a dualistic worldview, you think consciously. You're thinking, I want this to be the only truth on the planet. In other words, I want to elevate mine to be dominant and suppress the opposite completely. But subconsciously, you are projecting a dualistic worldview. So you are giving some energy to the polarity you think is true, but you're also giving some to the opposite. It can't be another other way. And that means that after a while, that opposite polarity is going to raise its ugly head and seem to threaten what you have. And therefore, what I'm trying to say with all of this is that even though for a time one of these dominant beings can seem that it has success on the planet, it can't last. It can't last. There will be threats. And so now what? What does this dictator, almighty dictator, now have to do? Well, it has to explain why everything isn't wonderful as it promised the people. Because the dictator always says to the passive people, follow me and it will be paradise on earth. Then when it isn't paradise on earth, the dictator has to explain why. And that's why the dictator actually doesn't want to fully suppress the opposite polarity, because the dictator needs a scapegoat so it can say, well, I promised you that everything would be wonderful, and I know it isn't, but that's because of these other people, this other polarity. They are the ones who are responsible for why I can't give you what I promised. So, in other words, to avoid going into too many details, you had these planets, let's say again the fourth sphere. One or a few people had set themselves up as dominant, and they had created a personal drama on steroids for why they couldn't give the people what they promised, why they couldn't create complete harmony and coherence. And some of them gradually developed a more epic version of these dramas. Because, again, if you take the duality consciousness to its extreme, what does it lead to? Well, it leads to the realization that there are always two opposites. So it leads to a worldview where there must be two opposites. And what's the ultimate pair of opposites, as we see them on earth at least? Well, it's God and the devil. The world was created by a God who is almighty, all-knowing, and all-good. This all-good being created the earth. But why is there suffering and conflict and this and that on the earth? Well, because this good God isn't alone. There's a devil who's opposing him. That's one version of the ultimate dualistic worldview. Two opposite forces. The Gnostics, for example, had the God and the demiurge that were in a constant dualistic struggle about who would ultimately control the world. And so this now leads to the epic drama where there is some cause. The cause is bigger than any person. That's why it goes beyond the personal dramas. The cause is bigger than a person because it's ultimately the fate of the entire planet that's hanging in the balance, so that the good polarity must win by eradicating the evil one. When you have connection to the Christ mind, the one mind, you can see that this is just duality. It's all an illusion. because both of the polarities are illusions. They are created out of separation, but they are also created simultaneously. You can't create one without the other. A dualistic idea must have an opposite. And so when you are in the Christ mind, you can see that the one dualistic polarity, call it good or whatever you want to call it, could never eradicate the opposite one. Because they came into being at the same time, they must disappear at the same time. How did they disappear? By you connecting to the Christ mind, seeing that both are illusions. But those beings who were in the duality consciousness, they couldn't see this. They could if they'd been willing to connect to the one mind, but they weren't because, as I said, they had taken, as I said, the personal dramas are based on denying that the Christ is in you. And those who had become the dominant beings, the dictators, they had taken that denial to a pretty extreme level. So, now, you see already here you have the origin of epic dramas. Because the definition of an epic drama is that it's based on a duality consciousness, there are two opposites, and it's epically important for the fate of the universe or humanity or the planet or whatever that the good polarity wins over the bad polarity. And of course the epic drama makes it impossible to see that they're both illusions, that it's an impossible quest. So now what happened in the fourth sphere was that there were some beings who had done this, that set themselves up on these planets, and they were in duality. And they were thinking that any day now, we're going to win the ultimate battle between good and evil. Any day we're going to win. But of course they didn't. Time passed, a very long period of time passed, and they still hadn't won because, of course, they couldn't, but they couldn't see it. So then there comes a point where the entire fourth sphere, the vast majority of the beings in that sphere, they were ready to ascend or had already ascended. So basically, a critical mass had been reached so that the entire sphere was ready to ascend, become a permanent part of the spiritual realm, which means what? Which means that there cannot be in the spiritual realm any beings who are in duality. So now the question was, well, what do we do? Do we delay the ascension of the entire sphere to give these beings more time to see through the futility of duality, the epic struggle, or does the sphere ascend? And for a time the ascension was actually delayed, but then there came a point where it was decided it's time to let the fourth sphere ascend. So what to do with those beings who are still in duality? Well, we are allowing them to then fall into the fifth sphere and take up embodiments there on certain planets that were created specifically for them. Which basically meant that the planet had to have a certain density of matter that made it possible for them to uphold the denial that the one mind is behind everything. So before the fourth sphere ascended, the ascended masters appeared on these planets, confronted the dictatorial beings, showed them clearly the futility of the duality consciousness, how impossible the quest was, and gave them an opportunity, and all beings on the planets, an opportunity to start the upward path and to very quickly be given assistance to catch up so they could ascend with the fourth sphere, or at least be on a positive path if they descended to the fifth sphere. And many of them chose to do this, actually. Many of them chose to do this and ascended with the fourth sphere. But there were some that chose not to do this. And so you can say, how is it possible that they could choose to do this? Well, because free will must be allowed to outplay itself. So this is what I'm saying, in duality, basically you can deny anything. So even though these beings were confronted with the Ascended Masters, the reality of the Ascended Masters, the power of the Ascended Masters compared to the power they thought they had, they could still use the duality consciousness to deny this. But how did they deny it? By using duality to create an even higher level epic drama. And what some of them came up with is this idea that the Creator was wrong for giving all beings free will. And be careful here. When you think about these topics, at least I find it myself, my logical mind wants to understand how they could do this. How did they reason? How did they think? Because my logical mind wants to think that they had some kind of logic that actually was logical, that made sense. But you see, after many years of contemplating this, I reached a conclusion. No. Yeah, they had some kind of logic, but it was dualistic logic. It was not irrefutable logic. It was not logical logic. It was not based on the one mind. So when it all boils down to it, it's not like there was only one decision they could have made and there is a superior reason for why they made that decision. No, they just made that decision because it seemed it was what they wanted to do at the time. They made a choice. They weren't forced to make the choice. It wasn't like they only had this option or that option to choose from. They just made a choice. And so they created this idea that the Creator made a mistake by giving all beings free will. Because this meant that some beings could be lost, as they themselves had been lost and as their blind followers had fallen with them. So now they came up with the idea that, and this could be said to be the ultimate outcome of the duality consciousness, that they knew better than God how the universe, how the world of form should have been created. Because they could have created it in such a way that beings couldn't fall and couldn't be lost. And they could do this if they were allowed to be in charge, because then they could force, they thought, all beings to ascend. But as I've explained before in several videos, how do you grow in self-awareness? By making choices and seeing the consequences and then evaluating, do I want more of this coming back from the cosmic mirror, or do I want to change what I'm projecting out so I get something different back? And this process only works if you have free will. Because only if you freely choose what you're projecting out, can you freely choose to change it. This is actually logical once you see it. And so these beings didn't grasp this because they're in duality, and so they thought that they should have been allowed to be ultimately in charge of the fate of the universe, and then they would have made sure that people were forced to ascend so no one would be lost. Of course, you can't be forced to ascend. You have to voluntarily and consciously give up the desire to experiment with duality, which is what they had not been willing to do. So essentially what they want, the fallen beings, and this is it's important to understand this because this is the origin of all the epic dramas you see on Earth. What the fallen beings want is they want to exercise their free will in a way that denies other beings their ability to exercise their free will. They want to take the free will away from everyone but themselves. This could also be said to be the ultimate illusion of free will. I'm the only one who should have free will, everybody else should be forced to follow my will. And so, without going too much into an abstract discussion here, we could say, as I said, the purpose of this world of form is to take a being with a point-like sense of self and give it an environment where it can gradually expand its sense of self until it reaches a greater consciousness. So the purpose of creation is God creation, creating gods. So isn't that what the fallen beings are just doing? Aren't they setting themselves up as gods? Well, from a certain viewpoint, from their viewpoint, that's what they're doing. But how are they doing it? They're doing it by taking the dualistic sense of self they have created and trying to make it more and more powerful, more and more sophisticated. So they think that the separate self can eventually reach the status of a god. The same status as the creator. Why can that never be done? Because the separate self is separated from the one mind out of which everything was created. You see, when I say that the purpose is to raise up other creators, the purpose is, as I said, to give beings experience with all levels of our world of form, so they know what works, what doesn't work, what is sustainable, and what is self-destructive. And this is what you realize when you start in an undescended sphere, transcend the desire to use your free will based on duality, and ascend. That you realize that. But the fallen beings haven't realized that. They have gone into separation. So even though they think they can create a sustainable creation where nobody gets lost, it's all an illusion. Because they're using duality, there will always be two opposing forces that will break each other down. Therefore, nothing they create is sustainable. They are thinking they are creating an alternative to the Creator's creation, but they are not. They are just creating a creation that will self-destruct. And they have destroyed a number of planets that self-destructed, but they still haven't been willing to learn from this. Because again, in duality, you can always deny. It wasn't us that caused this, it was these external forces. It was the devil, it was God, it was this, it was that. Always out there. Because what is the essence of the epic dramas? It's always projecting out. The cause is out there. It's never us and what we are projecting out. So in other words, the problem is what's coming back to us. The problem is never what we are projecting out. But how does a mirror work again? What you project into the mirror can only reflect back. So how can a problem be out there? How can the cause be in the mirror? It must be in what is projected into the mirror. But this is what you cannot see when you are in the denial that's based on duality. So anyway, to avoid making this too long, this is the central mechanism of the epic dramas. And there are a number of epic dramas, we'll talk about them. But this is the central mechanism. Again, you can say it's an extension of the personal dramas. It's based on the denial of the Christ in you, the denial of the one mind. And it's just the epic dramas take it up to a level that's beyond the personal level. There's some epic cause, perhaps the fate of the entire universe. And this, of course, means that it's more difficult to see through the epic dramas because you could say that when you are at the personal level, you want to achieve something personally. Like say, your drama is you want to be better at running the 100-yard dash than anybody else. Well, you can achieve this, or perhaps you don't achieve it. But whether you achieve it or don't achieve it, you can come to a point where you just had enough of it. You're just tired of that. You want to do something else. But when it's an epic drama, first of all, it can never be achieved, right? You could never actually win the epic struggle. But another thing is, this is beyond the personal level. So it's not just that you alone can win the epic drama. This requires, the entire universe, or at least everybody on Earth, to be in alignment, and how likely is that to happen? So it's once you're sucked into the epic dramas, it's much more difficult to get out of it, and that's why people can go from lifetime to lifetime to lifetime being trapped in one of these epic dramas. And that's of course why it's so important for spiritual people to be aware of this, so we can look at ourselves, we can look at our upbringing, we can perhaps have a sense, have I been trapped in fighting for one of these epic causes for many lifetimes? Have I used a religion, a political ideology, even a spiritual teaching to justify this epic struggle? And have I had enough of it? Do I want to transcend it? Then my only way to transcend it is to connect to the one mind, the Christ mind, which means the Ascended Masters. You ask the Ascended Master for help to see this, which of course is why they have given us these teachings and these tools. As I have said before, this isn't something I personally come up with. All these teachings are based on Ascended Master teachings, and this Ego Dramas is based on this book, Freedom from Ego Dramas, which was dictated to me by Jesus quite a number of years ago. So there's of course much more material about this in the book, but what I've given you here is just the highlights, and so you can have a basic understanding of how these epic dramas originated. And here's the real essence of what you need to get out of this entire talk. And it may take some contemplation. It took some contemplation for me, but the essence of it is, you cannot win the epic struggle. As a spiritual person, it is not a matter of finding some philosopher's stone, some ultimate spiritual technique, or even using the Ascended Masters to win the epic battle. It's a matter of being free. And how are you free? By walking away from the struggle. By turning the other cheek, forgiven 70 times 7. Saying, what is that to me? I will follow the Christ towards wonders. You cannot win the epic struggle. And I remember when I first found Ascended Master teachings, I reacted by thinking, oh yeah, by using Ascended Master teaching, by giving all these decrees to the Ascended Masters, we can win the epic struggle on earth. And it's not that giving the decrees don't have an effect. They do have a positive effect, but we're not going to win the epic struggle. You can only be free of the epic struggle. It's not a matter of winning, it's a matter of being free, and you're only free when you see it for what it is, and decide to walk away from it. It doesn't mean you can't do something for the Ascended Masters on earth, but it actually means that when you are free of the epic struggle, you can do much more for the Ascended Masters, because now you can be the open door. Whereas when you're trapped in duality, you are not the open door, because you think everything should turn out a certain way. And so this is something we'll talk more about in coming talks.